The early days of CD-based gaming brought more opportunity to create more immersive, realistic, and terrifying horror experiences onto home consoles, with Sega being one of the early adopters of the technology with the release of their add-on disc drive for the Genesis, the Sega CD. And they would even further turn the console into a bit of a Frankenstein's monster with the 32X upgrade. While the limited libraries for these add-ons doesn't give us a huge pool to dive into, we can still seek out some unique instances of Dithered dread here, from frightening FMV to blood-soaked beatdowns, and we'll explore a few closely adjacent examples as usual. Welcome to the next level of terror, as we check out every horror game on the Sega CD and 32X. We'll start things off here with one of the more infamous titles on the system, with Night Trap. Developed by Digital Pictures and published by Sega, with its first release in North America in October of 1992. Development of Night Trap actually began as early as the mid-80s as an interactive movie experience for a VHS tape-based game console to be produced by Hasbro, with the original live-action footage shot in 1987, but the system ultimately never materialized. The game's producer, Tom Zito, would eventually purchase the footage and founded the company Digital Pictures with other key members of the development team, with Night Trap kicking off a slew of many full-motion video-focused games for the Sega CD. The premise here has you taking the role of a member of the Sega Control Attack Team, SCAT, investigating the disappearance of a group of teenage girls last seen at the Martin family estate, which happens to be fully decked out with surveillance cameras and booby traps. By overriding the system and taking control, it's up to you and an undercover agent to protect the next group of girls by monitoring various camera angles and triggering the many traps throughout the house to keep them safe from an onslaught of lumbering vampiric beasts known as augurs. So once the game begins, you're presented with an interface that lets you select from 8 different camera angles of the estate, all with synced up video tracks, essentially seeking around until you spot any of these garbage bag sporting goons, and carefully timing the trap activation once your meter hits into the red. In the meantime, plenty of other happenings are also going on while the timer ticks on, where you can watch the story unfold and see characters interacting with each other, and start to piece together the dark secrets of the Martin family. Or just kick back and enjoy some of the absolutely charming B-movie camp. One downside here is that while you may often want to watch one camera angle where the plot is unfolding, meanwhile augurs are popping up in other places of the house, and if you miss too many capture opportunities, the house will get overrun and lead to a game over. To further complicate matters, the Martin family will occasionally change the security key color, and you have to be on the right color at the right time to continue to be able to control the traps. So what basically ends up happening is you'll restart the game several times to find the perfect route of every room and every event, which does lengthen the gameplay experience, but honestly can get a bit tedious, especially if you're trying to get the best ending without using a walkthrough. That experience is still a very unique one though, especially for its time. Night Trap also made some history in the gaming world at large when it was included along with Mortal Kombat in a US Senate committee hearing as an example of video games promoting violent behavior, eventually leading to the start of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, which is still used today. Night Trap is fairly tame by today's standards in terms of gore, but this particular scene here was taken a bit out of context during the hearing, even prompting some retailers to pull the game from shelves. Naturally, this press just generated even more buzz for the game, and eventually Night Trap would receive several ports, including versions for the 3DO, PC, and Mac, and even an enhanced version for the 32X seen here. The gameplay is essentially the same in this one, and you do need both console add-ons to play it, but it at least has some improved video quality and a visual overhaul for the interface. Over time, Night Trap has certainly become a kind of cult classic, and also got a modern re-release for its 25th anniversary, with even higher quality video footage, some deleted scenes, developer commentary, and several other special features.
Oh, thanks, Control. That was close.
Don't you love the smell of the sewers in the morning? They smell like victory!
Another Digital Pictures FMV game also developed for that canceled VHS-based console was Sewer Shark, released in November of 1992 on the Sega CD, going on to become one of the best-selling games for the console and eventually being included as a pack-in title for purchases of the add-on hardware. Leaning more into sci-fi territory here, the special effects innovator John Dykstra would be at the helm for directing the video footage, who is well known for his work on the original Star Wars and plenty of other big-budget blockbusters throughout his long career.
The critter's at 3! Not at 3!
Sewer Shark takes place in a post-apocalyptic setting where humanity is forced to live underground, and you're part of a team tasked with keeping the sewers clean of dangerous mutated beasts, and ultimately reach the island oasis of Solar City, as long as you can keep your performance above par. The core gameplay is similar to that of a rail shooter, where you'll guide your cursor around the screen to blast away dangerous creatures, while also listening to your robot navigator, who will guide you on a correct path through a maze of gloriously dithered sewer tunnels. Too many mistakes or missing too many energy refills could potentially end your run, or your scumbag boss could also force a restart if you don't obtain enough points.
Yeah, you see, I use classy words like that cause, I'm totally,
Classy type guy!
The mechanics are simple, but honestly pretty engaging once you get the hang of things, and of course the schlocky FMV cutscenes are a ton of fun. This probably could have benefited from light gun compatibility, but the D-pad controls work well enough, and the need for a controller does make sense when taking into account the tunnel navigation aspect. It's a bit short and lacking much depth, but it's a fun display of the early days of CD-based gaming. As mentioned before, this one is pretty light on the horror aspect, and certainly more in a crusty sci-fi action vein. But much like Night Trap, it's oozing with fun B-movie vibes, and it's actually pretty impressive technology for the time to keep the FMV footage flowing fairly seamlessly with the fast-paced action of the game. The early notoriety and success of Digital Pictures would lead to more FMV fun, including another post-apocalyptic jam with the Body Snatchers-inspired Ground Zero Texas, released in November of 1993. Aliens have arrived in a Texas border town, and it's up to you and your special task force to save the day.
You're the new tactical expert. Right, hop in.
Tricky part is that the aliens can disguise themselves as ordinary humans, and not unlike Night Trap, you have 4 battle cams to switch between and fire your lasers accordingly. This is another one that really could have benefited from light gun or mouse support. The D-pad controls this time around are pretty clunky and not very ideal for the somewhat frantic and precise shooting gameplay in here, causing a lot of unnecessary frustration and a somewhat annoying flavor of difficulty. But again, the FMV campiness takes center stage here, with some pretty laughably bad acting and action here, really nailing the old school B-movie vibes. Believe it or not, this game still had a $3 million budget, with some pretty clear effort put into the original filming, but ultimately constrained by the limited video codec capabilities of the console. The video quality even gets intentionally and hilariously worse as your health runs low, which I found to be a pretty creative way to lean into the crunchy and low-resolution look of everything.
You call that shooting? Let's see some firepower. I am personally going to call headquarters and find out what hole they dug you out of. Now shoot!
For those interested though, this one also got some nice re-release treatment recently, with a release on modern consoles with much nicer video quality.
you got a quick trip to the hereafter! My man! Welcome to hell, sucker! Get your booty down here, you poor damn fool!
1 year later would see the release of yet another Digital Pictures title, further refining, or maybe just rehashing, their formula into Corpse Killer. This time they ditched the camera angle gimmick and went all in on zombie blasting horror, with more focus on gallery shooting gameplay as you take the role of a random Marine dropped onto an undead-infested island on a mission to stop Dr. Hellman from taking over the world with his army of zombified ghouls.
Eternal death is inevitable.
Along for the ride is a sassy journalist and generally cringeworthy Rastafarian driver, each of which with their own motives as well, and you can actually pick and choose different missions to further their sub-stories on a small-scale open-world map. Generally, though, your objective is to shoot hilariously animated zombie sprites as video footage slowly pans through various locations, along with some acquisition of better types of ammo to handle stronger forms of enemies. And let's not forget some medicine to stay alive, and finally, you can attempt to raid Hellman's compound. While the open world stuff is a kinda nice touch and lets you see a wider variety of cutscenes while you play, it's still a pretty bog standard on-rails shooter under the hood. It is nice that some light guns are supported this time though, and even the D-pad controls feel a bit more effective than they did in Ground Zero, Texas. Not to mention more on-screen enemies at once keeps things a little more lively. Or, undeadly? Anyways, this one is unabashedly trashy, and if that's your bag, you will definitely have a laugh or two here. Corpse Killer also received a 32x upgrade with some slight improvements in video quality, along with ports for the 3DO, PC, an enhanced Graveyard Edition for Sega Saturn, and eventual modern re-releases with added content as well. And let's scrape one last bit of slimy goop off of the rail shooter barrel here with the Bug Blasters, which was made by Stargate Entertainment and originally to be released by Sony ImageSoft. But the release planned in 1995 was ultimately canceled as support for the Sega CD was fading away. Flash forward to the year 2000, and indie publishing company Good Deal Games would bring this crapster piece to the public. Perhaps the schlockiest FMV shooter we've covered so far in this video, and directed by the guy that brought us Tomcat Alley and Midnight Raiders, and from one of the co-writers of Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and Troll 1. Los Angeles is under duress from an onslaught of giant monster bugs led by General Grub and El Rocho. And yes, they can talk. And yes, we are treated to multiple cutscenes of very stupid bug puppet glory.
Any questions? Yes, El Rocho.
Do you think a boy and a girl should kiss on a first date?
Yes, sir. I hate you.
Yes, sir.
On the good guy side, you are part of the Bug Blasters, a pretty blatant Ghostbusters-ish squad of insect slayers who are the last bastion of defense against these mutated creatures, from giant bees to poop-flinging stink bugs. The camp meter is cranked to 11 here, with super goofy gags left and right, complete with nonsensical cartoony sound effects, and admittedly charming over-the-top performances from the cast here. It seems like they had a lot of fun making this, and the fun is actually a bit infectious as you watch along. Unfortunately, the fun doesn't really transfer over to the gameplay. Brace yourself for more D-pad-driven rail shooter jank with some questionable hitboxes, which are at least actually visible if you play on the easier mode. Interruptions are also abound here, as every shot will jarringly cut to a short video clip to show the result, which is probably an exploding bug, or maybe just getting berated by your exterminator teammates. It's hard to get invested in getting good at this one, as it's really just a vehicle to get to watch the bug puppet cutscenes.
Today only, honey. Come on, man, want some honey?
I didn't spend a ton of time on the hard mode, and maybe I'm missing something, but it felt nearly impossible to not run out of ammo and get a game over. So you might just have more fun on easy, or maybe watch a video playthrough. Now, one game that Sony ImageSoft didn't cancel before its release was a Sega CD version of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, based on Kenneth Branagh's film adaptation of the classic story. And you might remember the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo got their own atmospheric but rather janky action platformers, putting you in control of the stick-wielding creature himself. But meanwhile, the Psygnosis-developed Sega CD version would actually be an entirely different game, sewing together disparate genres like decomposing body parts. A majority of the game takes form as a point-and-click-like adventure game, with you in control of the monster, trying to make sense of your existence and search for your creator, Victor Frankenstein, by interacting with your surroundings, finding various objects, completing lots of fetch quests, and basically trying lots of random things until you get something to work. Where things get somewhat unhinged, and definitely not faithful to the source material, are occasional Street Fighter-style 1v1 battles, with your opponents ranging from disfigured mutants, angry street dogs, and Elizabeth Frankenstein. While these different kinds of gameplay feel somewhat undercooked in execution, it's the combination of the two and sheer disregard for sticking to the script that makes this game really memorable for me. It's funny because sometimes there seems to be some effort to stay faithful to the film in terms of locations, characters, and plot points, but then suddenly the game will go off script and completely defy any sort of expectation. I will say the presentation is pretty effective. It's nothing amazing, but the atmosphere is good and the graphics and animation are surprisingly intricate at times, and CG renderings randomly scattered throughout the game. But overall, this is definitely an odd one worth checking out, and one of the most pleasant surprises to me during researching horror on the Sega CD, especially since this title is so often forgotten, likely due to not even getting its own standalone release, but instead was bundled as a 2-for-1 deal with the previously released Bram Stoker's Dracula, which we'll naturally take a bite into next. And as I was saying, the Sony ImageSoft Psygnosis tandem would also put out a unique take on Bram Stoker's Dracula on the Sega CD, amongst a wide range of versions on other consoles and computer platforms that were riding the coattails of Coppola's hit film at the time. Like many of the other titles, you control Jonathan Harker in his attempts to end Dracula's reign of terror in various stages loosely based on locations and events from the movie, with gameplay here oddly following a side-scrolling beat-em-up formula in the pulsating vein of Kung Fu Master or Vigilante. So you'll awkwardly punch and kick your way through a handful of stages full of bats, bugs, zombies, and ghosts, and several boss fights, including a few different forms of Dracula himself. The controls are a bit janky, and it takes some persistence to get used to some weird hitboxes and enemy behaviors, so it's a steep learning curve at first, but it's somewhat reasonable once you figure it out. And of course, Sega CD games seem to love throwing in a random vehicular stage, with no exception taken here in a thrilling horse and carriage chase near the end. The aesthetic here is a bit unique and very much a product of its time, with heavy use of digitized sprites and scrolling 3D backgrounds, which even rotate from time to time. Not to mention some very crunchy and sometimes silent snippets of the film throughout, along with these fireside interludes to give things a more literary feel. So this game gets kind of a bad rap, and I can certainly understand why at first glance, but I actually really enjoyed this mixture of old-school single-playing arcade beat-em-up style action with the brutally compressed digitized look, and clearing the game provided a nice, short but sweet challenge. And maybe one of these days, I'm especially interested in checking out the Amiga version, which does reuse some artwork from this, but with quite a few gameplay changes. We can also embark on another FMV-centric adventure surrounding the Big Drac with Dracula Unleashed, released on PC and Sega CD in 1993. Developed by ICOM Simulations, who had also brought us point-and-click classics like Shadowgate, Deja Vu, and Uninvited. Here you take the part of Alexander Morris, who came to London to investigate the death of his brother Quincy and naturally untangle all sorts of mystery and intrigue, or maybe just getting eaten in a back alley.
And I was so lonely.
It's cold. You don't have a coat. Here, take mine.
The gameplay is not far off of a typical first-person point-and-click, although there's heavy use of video clips to propel the story forward and reveal clues crucial to your investigation. One nice feature addition here is an automated journaling mechanic to keep track of what seems most important. Time is also of the essence, as you'll need to keep an eye on the clock and be in certain places at certain hours of the day to make progress. Unfortunately, this can lead to a lot of soft locking, so you'll need to either abuse saving and loading functions, or simply replay the game multiple times to craft an ideal schedule and stay on the correct path and timeline of events. The interactive movie aspect had an ample budget and is rather well produced for what it is, but of course it could lose its appeal if you're repeatedly watching the same clip over and over again. Oh yeah, and you'll be spending a lot of time taking carriage rides.
23 Luxborough in King's Cross, driver.
Right on time, sir.
I'd say this one is a bit of a slow burn and on the dry side starting out, but it definitely has some cool moments and great atmosphere overall, and definitely worth a look for fans of the genre looking for something on the spooky side. While on the topic of FMV, there is a little handful of interactive movie-type games I wanted to mention that I'd consider adjacent to horror and worth a quick glance here, with each of these mostly consisting of quick-time event-style gameplay to advance the action. Dragon's Lair, the granddaddy of FMV games, was originally a Laserdisc-based arcade game from 1983, with beautiful animation by Don Bluth, requiring specific button inputs to guide Dirk the Daring through a precarious castle to save Princess Daphne. Known for its brutal difficulty and numerous and hilarious ways to die, the Sega CD port doesn't pull any punches either, with extreme levels of precision needed for survival. The Masked Rider is an interactive movie title that uses footage from the Kamen Rider Zo film, and surprisingly even got a North American release on the Sega CD in 1994. Genre-wise, it's very much tokusatsu sci-fi action, but I think horror fans will definitely dig the crazy creature design here from legendary Keita Amemiya. Just don't expect much depth from the gameplay, it's a lot more watching than actual doing. And one more here, the cyber horror Lawnmower Man movie received a handful of games to go along with the release of the film, while the Sega CD version is a port of the PC FMV adventure, with a mix of reflex and memory-based QuickTime event stages, but all with that 90s as hell CG imagery taken directly from the film, or at least inspired by it. It's definitely worth a look for the surreal aesthetics alone.
Now to get out of here, simple combination.
Access denied.
Remember, she said that there's ghosts there, and that they turn us into butterflies if we stared at one long enough, especially during a full moon.
And if you've ever been disappointed with a low quantity of butterflies in your horror games, have I got one for you here with Mansion of Hidden Souls. Not to be confused with The Mansion of Hidden Souls on the Sega Saturn, which is actually a sequel and not a straight port or remake despite the nearly identical title for the localized release. Anyways, the Sega CD original is a short and surreal horror adventure bearing some visual and mechanical similarities to games like Myst or D, with 3D rendered first-person FMV animations being utilized to move you through various areas of a creepy mansion searching for your sister who had been chasing after a mysterious butterfly.
So you like the butterfly collections here? I collected them all when they were ugly human figures.
As you explore, you'll meet other ghosts who had been turned into butterflies by the mansion's keeper, and you'll need to solve a handful of cryptic but fairly simple puzzles to save your sister from a similar fate. This one is pretty drenched with vibe, although you shouldn't expect any obvious jump scare or gory kinds of horror here. And sometimes things might feel a little goofy, but the general atmosphere and strangeness of the dialogue is undeniably unsettling and eerie, not to mention some excellent lo-fi ambient loops for the soundtrack, and the graphics are also pretty solid for the technology at hand.
As they steal their victims' bodies in order to take their place, these mysterious invaders become known as Snatchers.
And for what might be one of the most beloved adventure games on the Sega CD, and perhaps of all consoles, we have to make mention of Hideo Kojima's cult classic Snatcher, originally released on Japanese computer platforms in 1988 by Konami, and eventually remade for some CD-based consoles in the 90s, with the Sega CD version being the only one localized for Western audiences. Genre-wise, this leans much more heavily into cyberpunk and sci-fi, with influence from films like Blade Runner, but it's definitely on the darker and gorier side of things, with some body snatchers and Terminator inspiration as well.
Dear God.
The story takes place in the near future, where robots known as Snatchers have been murdering humans and stealing their identities. You control Gillian Seed, a junker tasked with investigating and hunting down Snatchers, while also dealing with a recent case of amnesia. With a fairly standard visual novel style of interface, you can pick your way through various dialogue trees and actions to further the story and work through a few puzzles, which is mostly presented with static anime-style artwork with some minor animations. You also have a self-driving vehicle to take you around various locations within Neo Kobe City, along with occasional shooting gallery moments where you may have to solve your problems with gunfire. While these aren't very frequent, it's pretty great that they are light gun compatible if you're packing a baby blue Justifier, and I gotta say, having to quickly reach for your gun at times is super satisfying and pretty immersive.
Die, junker!
Gameplay mechanics aside, the engrossing story and cinematic feel steal the show here, with a heady dystopian spin that Kojima would develop further in later projects, along with mature themes and levels of graphic violence pushing boundaries for its time.
Jeez, those things don't go down easy.
The Sega CD version did see a few minor bits of censorship, and some of Gillian's sleaziness has been toned down a bit, but it does at least retain the added third act from the PC Engine port, along with some very well done voice acting, which is impressive considering the sheer amount of translation required. Some of the movie inspirations are rather obvious and bordering on copyright infringement at times, but the sum of its parts keeps things fresh and is by no means a carbon copy of the works that inspired it. I don't want to dig too deep into the plot today, as I think going spoiler-free on this one really adds to the experience. Unfortunately, the Sega CD version was a commercial failure, being near the end of the Sega CD's life cycle, with somewhat rare complete physical copies pricing well into the $1,000 range, and who knows if Konami will ever make a modern re-release or remaster at this point. So I guess I'll just say to take whatever means necessary to play this one if you can. It's deservedly considered a masterpiece of its type.
Good God!
And one more cyberpunk adventure title I want to quickly show off here is Rise of the Dragon, originally released for DOS in 1990, but eventually finding a home on Amiga, Mac, and finally the Sega CD. Much like Snatcher, this one is a bit more adjacent to horror thanks to its dark dystopian cyberpunk tone and impactful moments of gore. You play as William Blade Hunter, a private eye in Los Angeles circa 2053, investigating the bizarre death of the mayor's daughter, caused by a lethal drug that mutates and disfigures its victims. Gameplay is mostly first-person point-and-click style interactions, but with some notable additional mechanics involving the passing of time in-game, a semi-open world, a few brief action scenes, and some butterfly effect situations where previous actions can affect outcomes later in the game's story. As far as the Sega CD version goes, it's definitely more green, partially due to a limited color palette, but most importantly, it added fully voiced characters, featuring the talent of Cam Clark for the protagonist, a voice you might recognize as Leonardo from the original Ninja Turtles cartoon, amongst lots of other voice work in animation and games.
What the hell are you talking about?
5,000 years he's waited. We're all doomed.
You've been drinking too much rot gut.
We're all doomed. Doomed.
The classic sci-fi action film The Terminator, which I've always felt had a lot of slasher movie elements as well, was of course the subject of tons of video games, including this run-and-gun title on the Sega CD, developed and published by Virgin Games in 1993. Now, Terminator games are very hit or miss, but this is probably one of the better ones to check out. It's pretty straightforward for its genre, but it just feels solidly made and has just the right amount of challenge. Features we could only have thanks to CD technology are the obligatory heavily compressed video clips from the film, and a pretty bangin', if not sometimes out of place soundtrack from Tommy Tallarico and several other contributors. But I gotta say, this Techno Man tune is an absolute jam. Speaking of sound, let me get out my audio nerd excitement real quick here, but this has the wildest sound test I've seen in a while, with full pitch control of every sample from the game. All that aside, again, this is kinda generic, but it's still a very solid and entertaining run and gun, a fairly underrepresented genre on the Sega CD, and definitely worth a playthrough for fans of the original movie. And here's another run-and-gun-ish title in the system, but with a lycanthropic twist, Wolfchild, developed by Core Design, who actually ported several of their games to the Sega CD platform, like Heimdall, Chuck Rock, and Wonder Dog, just to name a few. Originally released on the Amiga and Atari ST, Wolfchild gradually received ports on other consoles like the Super Nintendo, Master System, Game Gear, Sega Genesis, and finally the Sega CD version you see here. You play as Saul, the son of a scientist who is kidnapped by the Chimera Corporation, and you utilize one of his inventions to basically turn yourself into a powerful werewolf dude to be able to save him. It's an action platformer very much in line with the style and mechanics of other Amiga stuff of the era, like Shadow of the Beast or Switchblade 2, but with the werewolf hook coming into play if you can keep your health up high enough. As a human, you're stuck with short-range punching, but your wolf form gives you powerful long-range projectiles that are pretty crucial to survival. There are also lots of modifiers to your shots that can be attained along the way. It's a pretty decent and fun experience overall, even if it doesn't really bring anything new to the table. As far as the Sega CD port goes, it plays very similarly to the Genesis version, with the most apparent changes being the different soundtrack and an expanded intro cutscene. I'm a bit torn as to which music is better. Both versions of the score are quite good, but I might prefer Matt Furness's FM synthesized Genesis sound a little bit more in this case. And speaking of Amiga, the sequel to Shadow of the Beast, originally released in 1990, would also eventually find its way onto the Genesis and the Sega CD. You again play as Arbron here, this time in more of a half-beast form, searching for your kidnapped sister in another surreal open world full of dangerous monsters and environments. And again, like the original, the difficulty curve is brutally high, and it will require a lot of patience to find the right path through everything. Although the 1994 Sega CD version did see some rebalancing in this regard, with some slightly altered sections of the game. Other upgrades include some graphical tweaks, like some fancy yellow armor for your character, a new soundtrack, voice acting, and FMV cutscenes. This one is more in the dark fantasy camp than horror for the most part, and some of the music changes for this version probably make the atmosphere even less eerie and ominous than earlier ports, but it's still certainly worth a look if you enjoyed the first game. The next up is Heart of the Alien, a Sega CD exclusive sequel to the cinematic platforming masterpiece Another World, which is also even included in its entirety on the same disc. The story continues directly from the end of the first game, but this time putting you in control of Buddy, Lester's alien friend who helped him previously. After landing and giving Lester some time to rest, Buddy decides to find his trusty whip and save his fellow villagers from the prison complex he escaped from, with gameplay taking a very similar feel to the original game, but with some added swinging mechanics and slightly different behavior for creating shields and laser combat in general. The trial and error difficulty carries over as well. While you have unlimited lives, you'll definitely need to work your way through dying over and over again in often terrifying or hilarious ways, in order to figure out how to progress through reflex-intensive and sometimes puzzling sections. The game's minimalist and rotoscoped look has also returned, with a similar distinctive art style and smoothly animated action and cutscenes, and all of this despite the lack of direct involvement from Eric Chahi, the original designer of Another World. While at first he was on board with designing the sequel from the aliens' point of view, but he ultimately felt that Interplay's development of the sequel was not up to his standards, and he publicly disowned the game entirely after its release. It doesn't quite match up to the original, and it has some pretty uneven difficulty in spots, but I'd still consider it to be a pretty great game if you're into this kind of methodical gameplay, and definitely retains a lot of eerie atmosphere and surreal otherworldly vibes. It's pretty wild that this one only came out in North America within the niche library of the Sega CD, but since then there have been fan-made efforts to port the game to modern computers or even an Amiga version with the same assets. And of course, I must make a bit of a stretch outside of pure horror and make quick mention of our favorite seemingly cute little dolphin adventure game. Ecco simultaneously remains a masterclass in atmosphere and underlying psychological terror. I won't spoil too much here, but I think anyone who has made it to the end of this one will totally understand how this made it into a list of horror-themed games. Now, as far as the Sega CD version of the game goes, it's generally rather similar to the Sega Genesis original. It does feature some new and reworked levels, and an all-new soundtrack by Spencer Nilsson, which sounds rather new-agey, but fits the game quite nicely. Ecco's sequel, Tides of Time, also got an enhanced Sega CD version, again retaining the core gameplay, but with new soundtrack and added lore. And while these every horror game videos usually have a handful of more kid-friendly, Halloween-y kinds of games, the Sega CD library is actually pretty lacking in this department. If anything could nearly qualify, it might have to be Mickey Mania, a well-crafted platformer putting Mickey Mouse through various stages based on some of his classic cartoons, including 2 on the spooky side thematically, with a level based on the Mad Doctor from 1933 and one on Lonesome Ghosts from 1937. Now, this game also came out on the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, and PlayStation, but the CD-based versions have some enhanced graphics and sound, along with some expansions upon a few of the levels. All in all, it's a very capable platformer with a very cool concept for fans of the mouse, and was notably the debut design project for David Jaffe, who would go on to work on the Twisted Metal series and the first 2 God of War games.
He's gaining on me!
Now, we can't be having a horror game video without a Castlevania game, but I guess this is the closest we're gonna get, with Ernest Evans, a Japanese exclusive on the Mega CD, released a few months before the Genesis version would come out in North America. Now, this is the second part of a trilogy of games developed by Wolf Team, with the first being El Viento, with many Lovecraftian references as you control a Peruvian sorceress named Anett, and Ernest was a supporting character. But here, he gets his own time to bask in the spotlight and whip his way throughout various exotic places in search of 3 ancient idols before a rival treasure hunter does, as the 3 idols unfortunately hold the power of ultimate destruction. Now, this is certainly feeling more Indiana Jones than the gothic horror of Castlevania, but there are some cool monsters here and there, and the gameplay certainly has some similarities, but mix in a rather awkward and goofy-looking ragdoll character and anime cutscenes by Madhouse, and you've got a bona fide Jankster piece here. In the third game of Wolf Team's trilogy, Anett Futatabi would see an exclusive release on the Mega CD in Japan in 1993, putting you back in control of Anett, but gameplay switching gears here to a beat-em-up instead of the action platforming of the previous titles. On top of the usual generic moveset typical of the genre, you also have a slowly regenerating magic meter to unleash a handful of spells against your foes. Beyond this, unfortunately there really isn't much going on here, unless you really like jump-kicking weird mutant things, or standing around until your magic meter fills back up. The enemy AI is pretty terrible, yet combat can sometimes feel overly punishing, and just kind of annoying in general once you figure out how to work around their behaviors. It does at least have some cool cutscenes, but again, like Ernest Evans, they're only in Japanese with no translation available.
彼らはやがて人類最強の軍隊として世界を蹂躙するのです。
あなたは何を言ってるのか分かってるんですか?
It's kind of a disappointing conclusion to the trilogy. Anett Futatabi feels the most shallow to me, and there are certainly better beat-em-ups on the system. And here's one right here, with Sengoku, originally an SNK arcade title, but also receiving ports to the Neo Geo, Super Famicom, and the Mega CD, pitting you against a resurrected warlord and his army of undead minions. Sword fighting is more emphasized in this one, with a variety of temporary sword upgrades you can acquire, but you can also shapeshift into other forms, like a wolf, samurai, or ninja. Level progression is also interesting in the way you frequently change dimensional planes, from modern times to rocketing up into the cosmos and fighting off ghostly horrors in the clouds. Now, we covered the Super Famicom version by Data East in the SNES horror video, but this Mega CD version is definitely worth a look as well, with the graphics and gameplay feeling a little more faithful to the arcade original. Just to say, it's fairly mid, but it's solid and a pretty fun brawler overall, with some spooky supernatural elements. While we're on the beat-em-up tip, I also usually like to include a handful of 1v1 violent fighting games in these lists. While they're certainly not pure horror games, but they instead lean heavily into gory spectacle and monstrous creatures, so they may still be of interest. The granddaddy of them all, Mortal Kombat would find itself receiving a very capable port to the Sega CD, feeling much closer to the arcade original than the Genesis version, along with an equally impressive port of Mortal Kombat 2 for the 32X add-on.
Finish him. Sub-Zero wins.
The 32X would also see a port of Midway's prehistoric splatterfest Primal Rage, along with a system-exclusive fighter, Cosmic Carnage, which is more on the sci-fi tip, but still a blood-soaked banger. And we can't forget the Sega CD exclusive sequel to Eternal Champions, adding a heap of additional characters and FMV Cinekills. Now we'll dip into a couple darker-edged 32X titles here as well, first with a port of Doom, which was published as a launch title for the add-on in 1994. The massively influential demonic first-person shooter saw its fair share of ports to home consoles around this time, but in cases like this release and the Super Nintendo version, it's woefully inferior to the original on PC. The 32X version runs somewhat smoothly on the hardware and is a big improvement over what came out on the SNES, but gameplay still doesn't fill the entire screen, the music and sound design are quite poor, and controls are also rather limited, with a lack of circle strafing. Lots of content is missing as well, as this has 17 maps from the first 2 episodes, but cuts the 3rd episode entirely, omitting several monsters like the Cyber Demon. But hey, it's still Doom, and Doom is still a masterpiece, so there's certainly still some fun to be had here by default. And I always find it fascinating to see how this classic gets adapted to function across so many different hardware platforms. And speaking of which, I gotta mention Doom 32X Resurrection, a truly impressive fan-made effort fixing the shortcomings of the rushed original and adding a massive feature list ranging from split-screen multiplayer, improved visuals and sound, save functionality, 6-button controller and Mega Mouse support, and more levels and assets taken from the Atari Jaguar version. And one more dingy and dark fantasy title I always love talking about is Blackthorne, an early title by Blizzard with its first releases on DOS and Super Nintendo in 1994, and receiving a slightly tweaked version on the 32X the following year. I tend to sum this one up by calling it Prince of Persia with a shotgun. It's a cinematic platformer at its core, with a foreboding and grim atmosphere, and it's one of my favorites of the genre, mixing up cover-based gunplay, precise movement, and light puzzle solving. As far as the 32X version goes, it's interesting. The aesthetic gets updated slightly, with a rendered and digitized look to the main character and some enemies, and weirdly the layout of the HUD has shifted to the right side of the screen, giving the playfield a more squared-up aspect ratio. This overall change in style would also transfer over to a port on the Mac, released in 1996. But one big problem here is in the controls, as the limited number of buttons on the Genesis controller makes item selection and their use rather problematic, as it's combined with other movement inputs. But if there's anything to make the 32X version worth playing, it does have a new wintry area of levels added in, so fans of the game might want to at least check out the additional content there. Otherwise, I'd probably stick to the Super Nintendo or PC original. And as we near the end here, I also want to list off a handful of text-heavy titles released exclusively in Japan that were never localized, thus being a bit difficult to play through if you can't read Japanese. The 3x3 Eyes manga and anime series received quite a few video games in the 90s, including this fairly traditional RPG on the Mega CD. A-Rank Thunder Tanjohen, developed by Riot and published by Telenet, is an RPG adventure game hybrid with sci-fi horror vibes and lots of cool Guyver-like mutant monster designs. After Armageddon Gaiden is a Mega CD follow-up to Last Armageddon, a post-apocalyptic RPG putting you in control of a party of monsters instead of the typical heroes. Working Designs almost localized this one, but ultimately canceled the work as the Sega CD was waning in North America at the time. And we can't forget another post-apocalyptic demon collecting RPG classic, Shin Megami Tensei, which originally released on the Super Famicom, but received ports and remakes for many other platforms. The Mega CD version hasn't received any kind of translation patch that I'm aware of, but it's definitely playable in English on other consoles at least. Psychic Detective is a visual novel series with some creepy paranormal vibes, and received Mega CD versions of its 3rd and 4th volumes. And one last one here, which probably isn't heavy on the horror vibes at all, but it's the wild and weird RPG Wakusei Woodstock Funky Horror Band. I'll just let this intro speak for itself. which is code for I don't know what's happening. Yeah, we'll let this madness play us out here. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you found a few new titles here to dig into if you find yourself in a mood for dreadfully dithered delights. And if you like this format, make sure to check out some of my other videos covering every horror game on other retro consoles as well. And we'll catch you next time.